you all do. During the listening session over the summer, there were a number of issues that came up having to do with police and law enforcement, and specifically folks talked about domestic violence and about racial profiling, and I'm going to talk about both those things, but I want to start with talking about crime and immigrants. And the fact is that immigrants are overrepresented as crime victims. If you look at the crime victims in Montgomery County, significant overrepresentation from folks that are from our immigrant community. Oftentimes what we find is that immigrants are targeted as victims because of their because they look like they may be undocumented. And I'll give you an example. We had a group of folks that were committing robberies, and they were targeting Hispanic men dressed in clothes that looked like they might be a construction worker. And when we finally made an arrest in the case, these guys said that they would just drive up and down Georgia Avenue looking for someone that looked like they may be undocumented, whatever that looks like. And they specifically targeted those individuals because they said, we figured they wouldn't call the police. So what we've also found is that if you look at studies, 50% of all violent crime, and I'm not referring to homicides necessarily, but rapes, robberies, and assaults, 50% of violent crime goes unreported in this country. And when you talk about crime that occurs where the victims are new immigrants to this country, that number of unreported crimes goes even higher. Why do people not report the crime? Some folks from other countries don't trust the police, and they base that on the relationship they may have. They may come from a country where the police are not to be trusted. Some people are afraid of the police. Some people are afraid of being a victim, being victimized again if they call the police. We also find that if you look at the hate crimes that occur in Montgomery County, people are targeted based on their race, their ethnicity, or their religion. Those are the top three categories of folks that are targeted for hate crimes in Montgomery County. Now the good news is that we don't have a large number of hate crimes. The bad news is that we have any. And of course the fact that people are targeted because of their race, ethnicity, or religion, many of those folks are immigrants to this country. I want to mention human trafficking. It's not something that people are aware of or talk about a great deal, but I will tell you that human trafficking goes on all over this country, and it goes on in Montgomery County. We have forced labor cases, forced prostitution, servile marriages, workers being exploited. We just had a case last week where we made an arrest in a sexual exploitation case. It was actually based out of an organized Chinese organized crime gang that was based in Flushing, New York, that actually was operating in parts of Montgomery County. And we made an arrest in that case last week. Human trafficking, as everyone knows, is slavery, pure and simple. It's rooted in corruption, it's characterized by greed, and it displays a fundamental disrespect for the human spirit. We need to acknowledge its existence in our community, and we need to find ways to encourage the victims of human trafficking to come forward and cooperate with those agencies that are here to rescue them and protect them. And the fact is that the reason that victims typically do not come forward is because they're afraid of being arrested themselves, and they're afraid of being deported. So it's a very difficult crime to detect, but we're making great efforts to identify it and to combat it in Montgomery County. I think trying to talk about domestic violence after Vivian is like trying to talk about baseball after Babe Ruth has just spoken. And so I just want to touch on a couple of things that are specific to law enforcement. Like other violent crime, we believe over 50% of the domestic violence that occurs in Montgomery County goes unreported. As Vivian mentioned, 96% of the victims are women. If you look at, and most of those women are young women. Women are at greatest risk between the age of 20 and 24 to be victims of domestic violence. The men that we arrest for domestic violence typically are between the ages of 18 and 29. I think we've made huge strides in combating domestic violence and providing better help to victims of domestic violence in this country, and certainly in Montgomery County in recent years. And two of the things that I think are most significant are, one, the Family Justice Center, which is really a one-stop shop for victims of domestic violence, and in terms of providing assistance of all kinds, some of which Vivian talked about. But for police, there's been a notion, and it was mentioned about how many of our homicides are domestic related. And for many, many years, police would talk about the fact that, you know, if we were having a lot of gang-related homicides, we could target the gangs and see the gang-related homicides, reduce. But everybody just sort of threw up their hands and said, well, you know, those domestic homicides, not really much you can do about those, because, you know, it's not like we can get into people's houses, you know, when they're fighting and stop those. So there's not much we can do. Well, I will tell you that people much smarter than I actually figured out a way to really prove that that's not true. And a couple of years ago, we began using what we call a lethality assessment tool. Every time one of our police officers is dispatched in response to a domestic violence call, there is a sheet of questions that we ask the victim. First of all, of course, in Montgomery County, we have a mandatory arrest policy. If we believe there's probable cause to believe an assault occurred, we are mandated by policy to make an arrest in that case. But in any case, even if the aggressor is not still there, we ask the victim a series of questions. And what we've done is we looked at, we didn't do it, but other folks looked at a history of 30 years of domestic homicide. And they looked for, you know, what were the red flags, what were the commonalities of these cases, where if you would have been able to predict the future, you said, well, see, now this happened in this case, and this is where this turned, you know, fatal and it ended up in homicide. And what we've been able to do is put together a series of about a dozen questions or so that we ask victims. Things like, does the aggressor own a firearm? Has the aggressor ever threatened the lives of the children? And there's just questions, about 10 or 12 questions that we ask. And if the answer is yes to 3 of those questions, that triggers a referral, a mandatory referral, so that there's intervention done in that case that typically wasn't done in the past. And I have to tell you that I think this is an absolute life-saving change in the way police are handling domestic violence calls. And in fact, we have seen, and again, Montgomery County doesn't have a lot of homicides every year, but the year before this went into effect, we had, I think, 19 homicides, and 12 of them were domestic. In the last few years, less than half of our homicides have been domestic, and so I think it is making a difference, and certainly is getting people help that they need with our ability to better identify those cases that have the potential and certainly have the red flags to become more violent. Elder abuse is a growing concern for us in terms of domestic violence. In the next 14 years, the population of people over 60 years of age will double in this country. And we've had more and more cases in Montgomery County involving elderly victims, emotional abuse, physical, sexual abuse, financial abuse, where people are taking advantage of elderly folks. And obviously we work a lot on neglect cases and cases involving abusive caregivers. Vivian mentioned the U visas. Our family crimes division is very well versed in assisting domestic violence victims and other victims in getting U visas, and we're hopeful that as the word spreads that we assist people in that process, that there'll be folks that are less and less likely to be afraid to come forward. to talk to the police. I want to finish up by talking about racial profiling. And I think that when folks talk about racial profiling, that's really a small part of the real problem, which is bias-based policing of any kind. Racial profiling, of course, is using someone's race as a proxy for criminal behavior. It's unconstitutional, it's against the law, and it is in fact discrimination. And much of the public, I think, believes that at the core of racial profiling is that we have bad cops who deliberately act upon their preconceived stereotypes or their prejudices in terms of the way they do their job. In fact, I think that those are probably a minuscule percentage of the cases of racial profiling that we deal with. The fact is that everybody in this room, everybody in our community has some level of bias in them. And much of it, for many of us, we're not even aware of some of the biases and stereotypes that we may have that influence us. Police are no different. But so one of the keys for us is to make sure that we're hiring the right people, and we put them through a battery of tests to make sure that we're hiring people that do not demonstrate bias in the way they live their lives or in the way that they would do their job. It's not a perfect science, but we spend a lot of time trying to get into their head to make sure we're hiring the right people. We invest in their training, and this is the key. I think for most incidents where a police officer unlawfully racially profiles someone, it's because the officer lacks the training or understanding that they've done something wrong. The fact is that we spend a lot of time giving legal training and teaching officers what probable cause is, what factors you can use to establish probable cause, what factors you can use in involving suspicion. You get, if someone, I remember being on a stakeout one time, and we were watching for robberies at a particular 7-Eleven. And we were parked way back in the shadows and no one could see, but we were watching this 7-Eleven, which is across the parking lot. We saw a man come down and from behind the building, from the woods behind the 7-Eleven, and he walked to the side and he looked and he peered into the window. It was dark, so he peered into the window, saw what was going on inside. A car pulled into the parking lot and drove up and parked right in front of 7-Eleven. When he saw the headlights of the car, he jumped back to the side of the building and hid in the shadows. Now, I will tell you that with my training, with criminal profiling, that is suspicious. And the fact that we ended up approaching that man and asking him what he was doing, we patted him down for weapons, all of which we have a legal foundation to do. Now, if I would have said that the individual was, and you fill in the blank in terms of race or ethnicity, that's racial profiling. Because his race had nothing to do with the facts that I was using to establish that this was suspicious behavior. And when someone uses the fact, if a man had come down and the same man had come down and was just pacing back and forth in front of 7-Eleven, but wasn't trying to hide and just was sort of pacing back and forth, and someone said, well, but he's African American, so let's go check him out. That's wrong. That's racial profiling. That's discrimination. That is unlawful. And so it's a training issue for our police officers. The key here for the community, and this is not just the police and the immigrant community, but the police and the community in general, is trust. And if we're going to build that trust, the police department has to display integrity every day. We have to treat people fairly. And you've heard almost everyone up here talk about the necessity to treat people fairly. You have to know what you're doing, and this is where the training comes in. Officers should know how to do their job and do it lawfully and fairly. They need to know to treat people with respect no matter what the situation. And then you need to show results. And the fact is that police come in and address a community problem, and all of a sudden the people in the community feel safer because the police have been in there and made an impact.
or a person comes to the police and they actually get the help that they need. These are the kind of results that again, build that trust. I'll finish up by just saying that, we think that there are ways that you can identify whether you have an issue with regard to racial profiling and bias-based policing. We collect data, we look at the disproportionate minority representation in the criminal justice system. We look at the number of complaints we get and how we analyze them. We analyze how many people we stop, how many people we arrest, how many people we search. Those are all things that we need to keep track of to determine if we have an issue. So what do we do to guard against racial profiling? I mentioned we hire the right people. I mentioned we invest in their training. We've got to have clear and strong policies in place. One of our policies is we don't ask people about their immigration status. And we do that because it really makes no difference in terms of how we do our job. A person's immigration status is a fact that doesn't lead us any further down the road of establishing probable cause of whether something's suspicious or not. And finally, we need to hold people accountable for adhering to our policies. Well, how do we do that? We have an open and very accessible complaint process. People can complain in person, online. You can do it in whatever language you speak. We even take third-party complaints. We give our officers cultural competence training. We give them diversity training. We put cameras in the patrol cars. We establish strong partnerships with the community, which fosters good communication and good relationships. We don't always, I'm not saying that everyone's always happy with the police, but if you've got the good, honest communication going, you can deal with a lot of those problems. I'm going to stop there, but before I do, I cannot be in this forum and not mention the fact that I've testified in front of Congress on several occasions, urging them to pass comprehensive immigration reform, and secondly, and this is directly related to law enforcement, to keep immigration enforcement a federal responsibility and not to involve local police anywhere in this country in the enforcement of immigration law.